In the middle of February 2025, right as the coastal United States was looking ahead to what was predicted to be just a really volatile hurricane season.
Oh, yeah, highly volatile.
Right. Well, the U.S. government quietly laid off the people who fly planes directly into the eyes of hurricanes.
It sounds like a joke, but it's not.
No, it's really not. Yeah. Two flight directors for the famous hurricane hunters were just let go. It reduced their pool of available directors from the preferred staffing level of 10 down to 6.
Which is terrifying, honestly.
And, why did they do it? They weren't fired for performance issues or anything like that. They were let go to save money on a federal budget that hadn't even been fully debated yet.
Right, let alone actually passed by Congress.
Exactly. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are attempting to forensically examine the architecture of American scientific research during a highly specific and honestly incredibly consequential window of time.
Which is early 2025 to mid-2026.
Yes. Okay, let's unpack this because it's a period that fundamentally tested the structural integrity of how this country gathers, processes, and, well, utilizes scientific data.
It really did. And before we get into the weeds here, we should probably flag something for you, the listener.
Oh, right, the disclaimer. That is crucial.
Yeah. The primary source documents, the internal memos, the court rulings we're looking at today, they dive straight into some very politically charged actions and policies from the Trump administration during that specific window.
And our goal here is not to play politics or, litigate an election. We're essentially acting as forensic accountants today.
Exactly. We're following the paper trail. We're looking at the actual budgets, reading the judicial injunctions, and just seeing exactly how this structural shift played out on the ground.
Right. We're going to let the pattern and the evidence speak entirely for itself. We're not taking sides here.
Which, honestly, is the only intellectually honest way to approach a data set that is this complex. Because the core question we are framing today goes way beyond partisan politics.
Yeah, it's more of an operational question. What actually happens, on a granular, mechanical, day-to-day level when a government attempts to dismantle its basic science and climate research divisions?
Right, in order to focus purely on applied operations and deregulation. What happens when you try to cleanly separate the science from the operation?
Exactly. And to answer that, we're going to look at 3 simultaneous events that unfolded during a single budget cycle, specifically the fiscal year 2026 cycle.
A really intense cycle.
Yeah, it was. In this brief window, the executive branch proposed eliminating, or at least fundamentally restructuring, 3 massive institutions.
We're talking about the research arm of NOAA, the research arm of the EPA, and the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is known as NCAR.
And if there's an overarching narrative connecting all 3 of these institutions during this FY 2026 budget cycle, it is a recurring theme from the administration.
Cut the research line first.
Cut the research line first. The belief was that foundational research had become bloated, and the government just needed to pivot toward immediate applied outputs.
Which sounds good on paper, maybe, to some. But NOAA shows us the immediate chaos of a botched budget cut. Like, what happens when a proposal for the future just slams into the reality of the present?
Let's start there, actually, because the documents we have on NOAA provide the absolute starkest example of this collision.
We really need to look at the primary documents that set this all in motion.
Yeah.
So in the spring of 2025, we start seeing OMB passback documents circulating.
And for the listener who maybe isn't a federal budget nerd.
Right, which is most people.
Yeah. The Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, they don't just passively receive requests from agencies.
No, they issue what are called passbacks, which are essentially directives dictating what the agency's budget request absolutely must look like before it even goes to Congress.
Right. And following these passbacks, in June of 2025, we get NOAA's formal FY 2026 congressional justification document.
And the numbers in that document are just massive. The administration proposed an overall reduction for NOAA of $1.7 billion.
A $1.7 billion cut. That is roughly a 27% cut from its fiscal year 2025 level.
A 27% reduction for the agency responsible for everything from deep-sea mapping to managing the satellites that physically beam data down to your local weather forecaster.
But I want to play devil's advocate for a second here.
Sure for it.
A $1.7 billion cut sounds terrifying, obviously, but the federal government is massive. Agencies experience budget fluctuations all the time.
That's true, they do.
So is the administration entirely wrong to suggest that maybe a sprawling agency like NOAA has some bureaucratic redundancy that could be trimmed. I mean, if they just took a 27% haircut across the board, maybe they just buy fewer office supplies and pause a few long-term contracts.
I mean, if it were an across-the-board cut, you might be right. You could find some efficiencies. But the cut wasn't distributed evenly at all. It was a targeted strike on a very specific division.
Which division?
The Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, it's known as OAR, they were explicitly targeted. The proposal slashed their budget from roughly $656 million down to $171 million.
Wait, down to $171 million? That is a 74% cut.
Yep, a 74% cut.
You don't survive a 74% cut by buying cheaper printer paper. You are fundamentally dismantling the office at that point.
Precisely. And we really have to understand the mechanics of what OAR actually does, because it is not just a building full of bureaucrats sitting at desks in Washington, D.C.
Right, it's not just middle management.
Not at all. OAR is the engine of NOAA's future capabilities. It coordinates and funds roughly 10 different major research laboratories across the country.
Wow.
Yeah. It houses the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory in Princeton. It runs the National Severe Storms Laboratory down in Oklahoma.
Which is where the foundational research for tornado prediction happens, right?
Exactly. And it also funds 16 cooperative institutes that partner with universities across the entire country.
So at a funding level of just $171 million, OAR effectively ceases to exist as a functional line office.
It would have to. They cannot maintain those physical labs, they cannot fund the university partnerships, and they certainly cannot continue the climate research grants program.
Actually, didn't a leaked budget document explicitly propose $0, like literally $0 for climate research?
Yes, it did. Completely zeroed out. The administration's stated rationale for this proposal was heavily focused on bureaucratic efficiency. They argued that federal weather and climate research had expanded over like 3 decades into an unmanageable, sprawling ecosystem of external grants that was just too difficult to audit.
So they wanted to rein it in.
Right. They explicitly stated a desire to reorient federal science toward applied operational weather forecasting and away from what OMB Director Russell Vought termed climate alarmism.
Okay, so that is the philosophical shift. We are going to cut basic research, save money, and focus purely on the applied operations, the actual forecasting of the weather.
That was the theory. But here is where the theory hits the absolute brick wall of reality. Because you would think, okay, Congress has to debate this budget. It's for fiscal year 2026. We have time to prepare, time to gracefully wind down these programs.
But the executive branch didn't wait for the budget to be passed?
No, they didn't. The impacts began in February of 2025, driven by initiatives linked to the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE.
Right. Before the FY 2026 budget was even fully drafted by Congress, NRAA lost approximately 600 jobs in a single month.
600 positions.
Right.
Just gone across the agency.
And the brutal irony here is that the National Weather Service, which is the exact operational arm the administration claimed they wanted to prioritize, bore the absolute brunt of the staffing losses.
Because they laid off the people actually doing the work.
Yes. The primary source documents give us a really granular breakdown of what losing 600 jobs actually meant on the ground.
What did the numbers look like?
By mid-May of 2025, approximately 40% of the nation's 122 weather forecast offices, the local WFOs, were carrying significant staffing vacancies. 40% of them.
Yeah. And 52 out of those 122 offices had a vacancy rate above 20%.
Okay, let's follow a meteorologist in one of these offices to make this real for you, the listener. Imagine you are working at the WFO in Goodland, Kansas.
A critical office for severe weather.
Right. You're tracking severe Midwestern thunderstorms, looking for tornado signatures on the radar. Suddenly, 1 out of every 5 people on your team is just gone.
But the geographic area you cover hasn't shrunk at all.
Exactly. The weather hasn't slowed down. The workload stays exactly the same, but the human bandwidth to process the data just collapses.
And we have the operational notices proving exactly what happened next. The WFOs in Goodland, Kansas and Sacramento, California reached a point where they physically could not staff their overnight shifts during non-threatening weather periods.
Well, yeah, just closed for the night.
They had to hand off overnight monitoring to neighboring offices and basically shut down local operations for the night.
Which is incredibly dangerous if, say, a flash flood develops at 3:00 a.m. and the neighboring office isn't as familiar with your local topography.
Extremely dangerous. But it gets even more mechanistic when we look at the data collection itself, because the paper trail on the weather balloons is just undeniable.
You're referring to NWS Public Information Statement, PNSWSH 2508.
Yes, that's the one.
On February 27, 2025, the National Weather Service indefinitely suspended twice-daily weather balloon launches at Kotzebue, Alaska.
Yeah.
And they explicitly cited a lack of WFO staffing as the reason.
And it cascaded from there. In March 2025, Service Change Notice, SCN 2536, formalized the suspension of these balloon launches at multiple sites.
Not just Alaska, right?
Right. Omaha, Nebraska, Rapid City, South Dakota. 6 other sites across the country were reduced to only once-daily launches.
We really need to explain the mechanics of what a weather balloon or radio sand actually does, because it illustrates why this was such a catastrophic failure of operations.
I agree. Let's break it down.
So a radiosonde is a small instrument package attached to a massive hydrogen or helium balloon. They're launched simultaneously, twice a day, from about 90 sites across the U.S.
And as they rise through the troposphere and up into the stratosphere, they continuously measure temperature, atmospheric pressure, relative humidity, and wind speed and direction.
Let's use an analogy here, because I think people hear weather balloon and think of, like, some guy in a field letting go of a party balloon.
Right. It sounds a bit quaint if you don't know the science.
Exactly. Think of weather forecasting like a massive, high-definition digital photograph of the Earth's atmosphere. Every single balloon launch is a cluster of pixels in that photograph.
I like that analogy.
Supercomputers take all those pixels, look at how the air is moving right now, and use really complex fluid dynamics equations to predict where the air will be tomorrow.
And that is exactly how the grid models work. The physical data from those balloons is the absolute bedrock of the computational models.
So, taking out the Kotzebue, Alaska balloon site and the Omaha site isn't just losing a couple of minor data points. It is like actively lowering the pixel resolution of the entire atmospheric picture.
You are leaving giant blank holes in the map.
Right. Suddenly, the supercomputer is trying to calculate the weather, but it has a massive blind spot over western Alaska.
And because weather generally moves west to east across North America, a blind spot in Alaska on Monday means the model might completely fail to predict a severe blizzard in Chicago by Thursday.
Exactly. And that interconnectedness is what the administration fundamentally misunderstood when they tried to separate research from operations.
They treated the data gatherers as expendable researchers. They failed to realize that operations cannot exist without the constant active generation of new scientific data.
You cannot forecast the weather if you stop measuring the atmosphere.
You really can't. Which brings us back to the hurricane hunters.
Right, the flight directions we mentioned at the very beginning.
You are sending planes into the most violent atmospheric environments on Earth to gather the exact data that tells, say, the mayor of Miami whether to issue a mandatory evacuation order or let people stay in their homes.
And you're asking them to do it with half the preferred flight director staff.
And later reporting actually showed that only 5 of the 7 remaining directors were even flight qualified at the time.
The systemic failure was just immediate. The administration's argument was, we need to cut basic research to focus on operations. But the operations failed first.
The overnight shifts collapsed. The balloon network degraded. The hurricane flights were compromised.
It's like, imagine you own a car and you decide you really need to rein in your household budget.
Okay.
You want to save money on the car's future maintenance. So to hit your financial targets, you decide to immediately pry the headlights out of the car and sell them.
Okay. That's not a great plan.
But you make this decision while you are currently driving down the interstate in the dark during a torrential downpour.
Yeah, that captures it perfectly.
You cut the researchers to save money in the future, but your operational public safety mechanism breaks in the present.
And the government very quickly realized they couldn't just drive in the dark.
Right. Reality sets in.
They still desperately needed that atmospheric data from western Alaska. They couldn't just leave a blank hole in their models without risking massive forecasting failures.
So what'd they do?
The private sector had to step in.
Oh, wow.
A private tech startup called Windborne Systems actually began selling Western Alaskan atmospheric data back to the National Weather Service just to fill the gap left by the Kotzebue suspension.
Wait, I really want the listener to grasp the absurdity of this loop. The government defunds its own public service balloon launches because it claims it needs to cut costs and eliminate staff.
Right.
But the data is so legally and operationally critical that they instantly have to turn around and use taxpayer money to buy the exact same data from a private, for-profit tech startup.
Yep.
How is that achieving bureaucratic efficiency?
It isn't. It's an emergency patch for a self-inflicted wound. And it culminated in what the documents reveal as just a total panic reversal by the executive branch.
They realized they messed up.
Big time. By the summer of 2025, the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, had to step in. They granted a massive public safety exemption to the National Weather Service.
What did the exemption do?
They gave them direct hiring authority, entirely exempting them from the broader federal hiring freeze, and told them to scramble and hire back 450 professionals immediately.
Wow. By August 2025, CNN reported they were actively hiring back meteorologists, hydrologists, and radar technicians just to stabilize the grid.
They broke the system in February and were frantically trying to glue it back together by August.
So NOAA shows us the immediate chaos of a botched budget cut. The operational reality forced a reversal.
But what happens if an administration actually succeeds in dismantling a science division? What does the aftermath look like when the cuts aren't reversed?
To see that, we have to look at the Environmental Protection Agency.
Right. We are moving from a proposed elimination that bounced off the brick wall of reality to a completed, fully executed abolition.
Let's look at the EPA's Office of Research and Development. It's known as ORD.
The union representing the scientists at ORD called it the heart and brain of the EPA, and we really need to detail the sheer scale of this office because it was immense.
ORD employed roughly 1,540 staff members. We're talking about 13 massive, state-of-the-art research laboratories and centers scattered across multiple states.
Right. These were toxicologists, epidemiologists, environmental engineers, and chemists.
They were studying air quality indices, municipal drinking water contaminants, agricultural pesticide runoff, and the long-term impacts of Superfund site contamination.
Let's explain the mechanism of why the EPA needs 1,500 scientists doing this specific work. Let's follow a hypothetical senior toxicologist, we'll call her Dr. Eris, working at an ORD lab.
Okay, Dr. Eris.
Her job is to study a specific industrial chemical. Let's say a new variation of a PFAS forever chemical. She spends 2 years exposing cell cultures and animal models to this chemical to determine exactly what concentration causes liver damage.
A very specific, focused study.
Yes, and she then writes a heavily detailed, peer-reviewed paper establishing the exact toxicity threshold.
And that paper isn't just, an academic exercise. That peer-reviewed science is the literal ruler by which the law is measured.
Exactly.
When the regulatory arm of the EPA sets a legally binding maximum contaminant level in MCL under the Safe Drinking Water Act, they are legally required to base that limit on the best available peer-reviewed science.
That's the law.
Without Dr. Eris's independent study, the EPA cannot legally force a chemical plant to stop dumping that specific chemical into a local river because they have no scientific proof of the harm.
That is the crucial pipeline. Independent research feeds directly into regulatory enforcement.
But then Administrator Lee Zeldin takes over.
Right. Let's look at Administrator Zeldin's actions. On September 22, 2025, Zeldin issued a formal reorganization memo.
And what did the memo do?
In this memo, ORD was entirely abolished. It ceased to exist as an independent line office. In its place, the memo created OASES, the Office of Applied Science and Environmental Solutions.
OASES. And this wasn't just a rebranding exercise, right? It wasn't just changing the name on the letterhead.
Oh, no. This was a massive physical contraction of the agency. The total workforce fell to 12,448 people.
That is a reduction of more than 3,700 employees across the whole EPA. That's nearly 23% of the entire agency gone, compared to where they were just months prior in January 2025.
And the administration claimed this specific reorganization would save the government $749 million.
And again, we have to examine the stated rationale. The administration argued they were refocusing the agency on applied research rather than basic research.
Right. They believed RD had grown into a self-sustaining research bureaucracy, doing science for science's sake, completely disconnected from the EPA's core regulatory mission. They argued that science should serve specific, immediate regulatory decisions.
Okay, I understand the words they're using, but let's translate this into how it actually functions in reality.
Sure.
What is the actual structural difference between an independent line office like ORD and an office like OASES? Which, according to the memo, answers directly to the administrator's office.
The structural difference fundamentally alters the institutional culture and the management style of the science being produced.
How so?
Let's look at the management structures. ORD was an independent line office. That meant it reported separately, maintained its own budget allocations, and, crucially, operated with a firewall of insulation from the political appointees in the EPA administrator's office.
So Dr. Aris, our toxicologist, can run her chemical exposure tests and publish her findings independently without worrying about whether the current White House, regardless of whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, actually wants to regulate that chemical.
Exactly. The scientific inquiry leads, and the policy follows.
But OASIS is different.
Very different. OASIS, the new entity, placed applied regulatory science directly under the administrator's office. Critics, including dozens of former EPA scientists, noted that this creates a direct chain of command from political leadership down to the scientific researchers.
So you are moving from a culture of independent scientific inquiry to a culture of political oversight.
Precisely. And the risk there is profound. When science answers directly to political leadership, research can easily become entirely in service of enforcement or deregulation rather than an objective search for truth.
Because there's an agenda.
Right. If the administrator's office decides, for economic reasons maybe, that they want to loosen regulations on pesticide runoff, there is an inherent structural pressure on the scientists in OASIS to produce applied findings that mathematically support that desired policy outcome.
It shifts the management style from scientific peer review to political expediency.
And the toll this took on the researchers themselves was just staggering. The documents show that over 300 senior ORD staff took deferred resignation.
Deferred resignation.
Yeah. These were leading experts in their fields who chose to literally walk away, to leave federal service entirely, rather than work under the new OASIS structure and compromise their scientific independence.
They took early retirement or resigned just to escape the reorganization.
Exactly. And for those who didn't have the luxury of early retirement, up to 1,155 scientists faced layoffs from the former ORD.
Wow. And here's where we have to look at the hardest piece of data in the entire dossier regarding the EPA.
Let's hear it.
We know the administration claimed this restructuring would make the agency more efficient and focused. Did it? What actually happened to the scientific output?
Well, by May of 2026, Federal News Network analyzed the raw data and reported a stark, undeniable metric. In 2025, the year of the reorganization and the mass departures, the EPA produced only 275 peer-reviewed studies.
Just 275.
That represents a 17% decrease from the prior year.
A 17% drop.
It is the first year of measurable decline following the staffing reductions. This is the mechanism at work. You lay off the scientists, your objective production of peer-reviewed science immediately drops by 17%.
And to tie it back to the listener, a 17% drop in peer-reviewed studies isn't just an academic tragedy.
No, it has real-world consequences.
It means there are 17% fewer safety benchmarks being developed for the pesticides sprayed on your strawberries, or, the heavy metals seeping into your local groundwater.
When the science slows down, the legal capability to protect the public slows down identically.
So we have seen NOAA, where the operational public safety reality forced hiring reversal. We have seen the EPA, where the administration fully executed their dismantling of the research office, resulting in an immediate drop in scientific output.
Which brings us to our third institution. And this introduces a completely different mechanism of government response.
Right. If the EPA was the administration's successful restructuring, NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, is the story of how the judicial branch of the United States government stepped in and drew a very hard, very public line.
We move from executive action and agency fallout into the realm of judicial intervention, and this was based heavily on the Administrative Procedure Act.
Let's set the stage with NCAR. Because unless you are a meteorology student, you might not really know what it is.
It's somewhat obscure to the general public.
Yeah. But NCAR is a massive deal in the global scientific community. Established by Congress in 1960, it's headquartered in Boulder, Colorado.
It is a federally funded research center, but it's uniquely operated under a contract by UCR, which stands for the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research.
And UCR is a massive consortium of more than 100 universities across North America. It is essentially the connective tissue of academic atmospheric science.
And NCRR relies heavily on funding from the National Science Foundation, the NSF. They get an annual grant of about $123 million from the NSF, which covers well over half of their operating budget.
And what do they actually do with that money? Two incredibly important things for our story today. First, they operate the NCR Wyoming Supercomputing Center up in Cheyenne,
which is the centerpiece of America's non-commercial atmospheric modeling capacity.
We should probably explain how a climate supercomputer differs from standard computing.
Yeah, that's a good distinction to make. A normal computer processes tasks linearly, one after the other. The Wyoming supercomputer utilizes massively parallel processing to run coupled ocean-atmosphere models.
What does that actually look like?
It literally divides the entire Earth's atmosphere and oceans into millions of 3D grid boxes. And it calculates the thermodynamic exchanges of heat and moisture between every single box simultaneously, stepping forward in time over decades.
Wow. It is an astronomical computational burden.
It is the machine that tells us what the climate will look like in 50 years.
Okay, so that's the first thing. Second, NCAR maintains two heavily modified NSF-funded research aircraft that physically fly into storms to sample atmospheric chemistry and physics.
So those are the physical assets, the supercomputer and the aircraft. And those specific assets became the direct target of the administration's budget strategy.
We have an internal OMB staff memo dated November 19th, 2025. This memo was later released during the lawsuit, so we can see the exact language.
And what does it say?
The memo outlines a very specific demand. It orders the NSF to accelerate a restructuring of NCR. The directive is to spin off the Wyoming Supercomputing Center, basically strip it from UCR's control and give it to someone else, potentially the University of Wyoming, and to divest the two research aircraft.
And critically, the memo explicitly orders the NSF to rescope NCIR's entire institutional mission, quote, to focus on weather and not on climate modeling, end quote.
There is that exact recurring theme again. Move away from climate, focus only on immediate weather.
But the sequence of events that follows this November 19 memo is absolutely crucial because it forms the entire basis of a massive federal lawsuit.
Let's lay out the timeline exactly as it occurred in December of 2025.
Okay, picture this. It is December 15, 2025. President Trump publicly criticizes Colorado Governor Jared Polis by name on social media. It is a highly publicized, purely political clash.
Okay, and then what happens?
The very next day, December 16, 2025, OMB Director Russell Vought publicly announces via social media that NCIR, which remember is headquartered in Boulder, Colorado, will be, in his words, broken up.
Wait, hold on. The day after the president gets into a public spat with the governor of a state, the administration announces they are dismantling that exact state's premier federally funded research center. That doesn't look like a carefully considered budgetary policy. That looks like a drive-by shooting.
And that appearance of retaliation is exactly what triggered the legal scrutiny. What's fascinating here is how the government tried to justify it afterward.
Let's continue the timeline.
Following Vaught's announcement, the National Science Foundation realizes they have to go through the formal legal process for this kind of transfer. They open a public comment period, often called an RFI, a request for information.
Standard procedure.
Right. They set a deadline of March 13th, 2026, for the public and the scientific community to submit their feedback on this proposed breakup.
It sounds like standard bureaucratic procedure. The law says you have to ask the public for their opinion before making a massive change.
But here's the catch, and this is the smoking gun of the lawsuit. Internal NSF emails that were later forced into the public record during discovery show that the NSF had already made their final internal decision to proceed with transferring the supercomputer by February 12, 2026.
Wait, a full month before the March 13 public comment deadline had even closed.
A full month.
They were actively asking the public and the universities for their comments, pretending they were listening, but internal emails showed they had already pulled the trigger weeks earlier. No wonder they got sued.
Exactly. On March 16, 2026, UTAR, representing those 100-plus universities, filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court for the District of Colorado.
Who did they sue?
They sued everyone, the NSF, NOAA, the Department of Commerce, OMB, and all their respective directors.
And the culmination of this lawsuit brings us to June 1st, 2026. U.S. Senior District Judge R. Brooke Jackson issues a massive 38-page preliminary injunction that completely blocks the transfer of the supercomputing center.
The government is legally halted in its tracks.
Judge Jackson's ruling is essentially a masterclass in the application of the Administrative Procedure Act, the APA.
For context, the APA is the bedrock law that prevents government agencies from acting like dictatorships. It requires them to operate transparently and rationally.
We need to detail the three pillars of Judge Jackson's reasoning because he systematically dismantles the administration's actions.
Let's do it. Pillar number 1.
Pillar 1 is procedural illegality. Judge Jackson found that the government simply ignored the law regarding public consultation.
He pointed directly to that timeline we just discussed. The NSF decided to proceed on February 12, entirely ignoring the public comments that were still coming in ahead of the March 13 deadline.
Furthermore, he wrote that the government, quote, never explained why UCI shouldn't control this supercomputer facility.
They offered absolutely no substantive policy justification or performance review for taking it away from the consortium that had successfully run it for decades.
They just ordered it done, which leads to Pillar 2, arbitrary and capricious decision-making.
Yes. In administrative law, an agency cannot just make a massive decision on a whim.
So basically, arbitrary and capricious means you can't just run a government agency on vibes. You have to show the math. You have to prove that you analyzed the facts and came to a logical conclusion.
Precisely. You have to show the math. And because they made the decision a month before the comment period ended, Judge Jackson ruled that the entire public comment process was a sham.
Which entirely undermined the legitimacy of the agency's decision-making process.
They didn't show the math, they hid it. Therefore, it was, by legal definition, arbitrary and capricious.
And then we get to the third pillar. And this is the most explosive part of the 38-page ruling.
Pillar 3, political retaliation.
Judge Jackson looked at the timeline of December 15th and December 16th. The president's public criticism of the Colorado governor followed less than 24 hours later by the OMB director announcing the breakup of a Colorado-based research center.
The judge explicitly wrote that this sequence, quote, suggests retaliation played at least some role in the decision.
He actually put that in a federal ruling.
He really did. He went on to state that an action, quote, motivated even in part by political or personal animus, as opposed to an analysis of the relevant facts and data, would demonstrate that the agency acted arbitrarily and capriciously, end quote. The court looked at the government's own documentary record and found that it was completely inconsistent with a straightforward, rational efficiency rationale. The evidence strongly pointed to political animus driving the timeline.
So the injunction holds. The supercomputer stays with UCR, for now, where the case proceeds. It is a massive legal victory for the consortium.
It is. But even with the injunction, we have to look at the human cost here.
Because just like at the EPA, the mere threat of this dismantling caused immense damage.
In their injunction filing in April 2026, UTR documented what they termed a severe brain drain.
This is where we see the fragility of the scientific ecosystem. Researchers, highly specialized data scientists, and administrative staff were already departing the institution.
Let's follow a postdoc researcher. We'll call her Elena. She relies on the NCAR supercomputer to run her climate models.
Okay, Elena.
She spent years writing the code for her simulation. When the OMB director goes on social media and announces your lab is going to be broken up, Elena doesn't necessarily wait around for 6 months to see if a federal judge will magically save her job.
Right. She has rent to pay. She has a career to build.
Exactly. She starts taking interviews with private tech companies or European universities.
The human cost is profound job uncertainty. And the budgetary impacts stretch far beyond the immediate staff in Boulder. Think about the students and the early career researchers entering these fields today at those 100-plus universities that make up the UCR consortium.
The disruption is massive. We mentioned earlier that the proposed budget completely zeroed out NOAA's climate research funding.
That was roughly $70 million annually that went straight into grants for university scientists.
When you freeze that $70 million in grants and you simultaneously threaten to dismantle the primary supercomputer those university students use to run their climate models, you are actively hollowing out the pipeline for future atmospheric scientists.
How do you convince a bright undergrad to commit to a PhD in atmospheric science when the government is actively trying to defund the field?
You don't. The loss of institutional continuity is something that cannot just be reversed by a court order.
If Elena, our leading climate modeler, leaves NCIR for a private tech company because she is afraid her lab will be dismantled, you don't just get her expertise back the day the judge issues an injunction.
That knowledge base is gone. The brain drain is, in many ways, an unrecoverable loss for the public sector.
Which is a deeply sobering reality. So we've looked at the executive proposals and their real-world fallout across NOAA, the EPA, and NCIR. We've seen the judicial pushback from Judge Jackson defending the EPA.
Finally, we need to turn to the legislative branch. What was the ultimate verdict from Congress on these budgets?
The final balance sheet is incredibly revealing. It shows us exactly where the legislative branch, which ultimately controls the power of the purse, drew their line in the sand regarding the dismantling of American science.
We are looking at the final FY 2026 Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Bill. This is Public Law 11974.
It was passed by the House of Representatives on January 8, 2026, by a massive bipartisan margin of 397 to 28.
And it passed the Senate on January 15 by a vote of 82 to 15. President Trump signed it into law on January 23, 2026.
I'll read the final numbers and we will let the pattern speak for itself. Remember, the administration asked for a $1.7 billion cut to NOAA.
Congress overwhelmingly rejected that. They gave NOAA a total of approximately $6.1 billion, which included an operations, research, and facilities budget that was $1.5 billion above the president's request.
They gave them $1.5 billion more than the White House asked for. That is a massive legislative rebuke.
It really is.
And what about OAR, the NOAA research office that was targeted for a 74% cut and effective elimination?
OAR was fully retained as a line office. Congress did agree to transfer a small subset of OAR's weather research programs over to the National Weather Service, as the administration had requested.
Which, is a highly defensible organizational principle to keep immediate weather research and operations close.
Right, but they flatly refused to zero out or eliminate OAR's core climate and ocean research funding.
And what about the National Science Foundation, which funds NCAR?
The administration proposed slashing the National Science Foundation's budget to $3.9 billion, a 57% cut. Congress completely rejected that.
What did they get?
The final law provided the NSF with approximately $8.8 billion. It was a slight decrease from the prior year, but it was nearly $5 billion more than the administration had requested.
Wow. The Republican-led Senate Appropriations Committee made it very clear in their markup that they were not going to dismantle the foundation of American scientific funding to achieve short-term budgetary wins.
So Congress rode to the rescue. They rejected the cuts, they fully funded NOAA's operations, they saved OAR, and they massively overrode the proposed NSF cuts.
So what does this all mean? Did the research agencies just breathe a massive sigh of relief, unpack their boxes, and go back to normal?
Unfortunately, no. And this is where we see the enduring, grinding friction between the branches of government.
What do you mean?
Passing a law and appropriating the money is one thing. Actually dispersing those funds through the executive branch bureaucracy is another entirely.
We need to explain this because people assume that once the president signs the budget, the agencies just get a giant direct deposit the next morning.
But that's not how it works. We have an incident from April 2026, months after the budget was signed into law.
Right. The process is called apportionment. Even after Congress appropriates the money, OMB, the executive branch, has to formally release or apportion the funds to the agencies.
Despite Congress unambiguously appropriating the money in January, staff at NOAA's Boulder Global Monitoring Laboratory suddenly faced furloughs in early April.
Furloughs. They were being told to go home without pay after the money was legally provided by Congress.
Yes. They were hit with an executive funding freeze. OMB simply delayed apportioning the funds, preventing the lab from accessing their legally appropriated budget.
Half the staff at the Boulder lab were staring down imminent furloughs.
This freeze dragged on for weeks, until April 16th, when $4 million in funding was finally quietly released and the furloughs were canceled at the last minute.
That is incredible. The law is passed, the money is physically there in the Treasury, but the executive branch just pauses it.
It highlights the ongoing administrative warfare.
The legislative branch can mandate funding all day long, but if the executive branch uses bureaucratic friction to delay or freeze those funds, the scientists on the ground still face the anxiety, the missed rent payments, and the operational delays of being practically defunded.
It is a war of attrition. Which brings us back to the central theme of our deep dive today. Let's synthesize what we have learned from tracing this timeline across NOAA, the EPA, and NCAR simultaneously.
We started with the mission, to see what happens when a government tries to dismantle its basic science divisions.
The administration's stated argument, uniformly across all three agencies, was bureaucratic efficiency. They wanted a shift toward applied operations, enforcement, and away from basic foundational research and climate alarmism.
But the undeniable pattern that emerged across all three agencies was exactly the opposite of operational efficiency. The pattern was, cut the basic, foundational science first, and watch operational failures immediately follow.
At NOAA, before the budget was even passed, the staff cuts forced the closure of overnight forecast shifts in Kansas and the suspension of weather balloons in Alaska.
You cannot separate the data gatherers from the data users without breaking the system.
At the EPA, they successfully abolished the Independent Office of Research and Development. They replaced it with an office directly under political control.
Hundreds of expert toxicologists and chemists fled the agency rather than work under political oversight.
And peer-reviewed scientific output plummeted by 17% in a single year, crippling the legal foundation of future environmental regulation.
And at NCAR, an attempt to strip away the supercomputer in research aircraft, driven by what a federal judge determined was likely political retaliation, triggered a massive brain drain of specialized computational talent from the university consortium.
The human cost here is the through line. You called it unrecoverable brain drain.
You can hire back 450 meteorologists under an emergency exemption, you can get a federal judge to block a supercomputer transfer, and you can get a bipartisan Congress to forcefully restore billions of dollars in funding.
But you cannot instantly replace Dr. Aris, the senior toxicologist who took early retirement, or Elena, the climate modeler who gave up on federal grants and moved to the private sector.
That institutional knowledge, once fractured, takes generations to rebuild.
Multiple branches of government, from bipartisan congressional committees to federal judges, ultimately had to step in to halt much of this dismantling. But the scars on the scientific infrastructure and the massive disruption to the pipeline of young scientists remain.
They absolutely do. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over.
Okay, what is it?
It builds on a very brief detail we mentioned earlier, during the chaos of the NOAA weather balloon suspensions.
Oh, the Kotzebue data gap.
Exactly. When the National Weather Service lacked the staff to launch their weather balloons in Alaska, they had a critical blind spot in their forecasting models.
And into that void stepped a private startup called Windborne Systems, who began selling that exact atmospheric data back to the U.S. government.
A fascinating pivot and, a glimpse into a potential future.
It really is.
And it raises a provocative question. If the federal government continually attempts to dismantle, defund, or bureaucratically freeze its own foundational data-gathering infrastructure,
Are we quietly, perhaps unintentionally, outsourcing the bedrock of global public safety, our weather and climate data, to private tech startups?
that is a profound implication. When data becomes a privatized commodity rather than a public good,
And if profit motives eventually dictate atmospheric data collection, rather than a mandate for public service, who decides which communities get accurate, life-saving forecasts, and which ones get left in the dark?
will a private company bother flying weather balloons over rural Alaska if the local government can't afford their subscription fee?
It's a scary thought.
It is something we all need to be thinking about the next time we check the weather app on our phones. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.